In the remote wilderness of Montana's Glacier National Park, where cell towers don't reach and the nearest hospital is 3 hours away by helicopter, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything we think we know about animal intelligence and compassion. What started as a routine patrol for a seasoned park ranger turned into a life-or-death situation that no training manual could have prepared her for. Suspended helplessly between life and death, she found herself completely at the mercy of the wilderness she had sworn to protect. But sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, it comes from a creature that society tells us lacks the capacity for complex thought or moral reasoning. What happened next would not only save a life, but would force an entire scientific community to reconsider what they thought they knew about the emotional depth of horses. This is the true story of Ranger Sarah Mitchell in Thunder, a wild Mustang whose actions defied every scientific assumption about animal behavior. It's a story that spread from a small ranger station to international headlines, captivating millions, and changing the way we view the relationship between humans and the animals that share our world. The rescue that followed would take 4 days, involve multiple agencies, and ultimately prove that intelligence and compassion aren't exclusively human traits. But first, let's go back to where it all began. On a crisp October morning, when Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would nearly cost her everything. Sarah Mitchell had been a park ranger for 12 years, and she thought she had seen everything the wilderness could throw at her. At 34, she was one of the most experienced rangers in Glacier National Park, known for her calm demeanor and her ability to handle any crisis that came her way.
Her colleagues often joked that she could probably survive in the wilderness with nothing but a pocket knife and her wits. That confidence would be put to the ultimate test on October 15, 2023.
The morning started like any other. Sarah woke up at 5:30 a.m. in her small cabin near the park headquarters, made her usual strong black coffee, and checked the weather reports. A cold front was moving in from Canada, bringing with it the promise of the first real snow of the season. The forecast called for clear skies in the morning, but conditions were expected to deteriorate rapidly after noon. Sarah's assignment for the day was to conduct a routine patrol of the remote northern section of the park, an area that tourists rarely visited but that required regular monitoring for illegal hunting, camping violations, and wildlife safety concerns. The territory covered nearly 40 square miles of rugged terrain, including dense forests, steep ravines, and rocky outcroppings that had been shaped by thousands of years of glacial activity. She loaded her backpack with the standard equipment: first aid supplies, emergency beacon, water purification tablets, rope, flares, and enough food for 3 days. Her radio was fully charged, though she knew that in the remote areas she would be patrolling, reception would be spotty at best. The nearest road was 12 miles away, and the closest ranger station was even further. As she drove her Park Service truck along the winding mountain road that would take her to the trailhead, Sarah reflected on how much she loved this job despite its challenges. There was something deeply satisfying about being alone in the wilderness, being responsible for protecting one of the last truly wild places in America. She had grown up in a small town in rural Montana, and the mountains had always been her refuge. Even as a child, she had felt more comfortable hiking alone in the forest than sitting in a classroom. The drive took her 2 hours, climbing steadily through forests of pine and fir, until she reached the remote trailhead where she would begin her patrol on foot. At this elevation, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level, the air was thin and crisp, and her breath formed small clouds in the early morning cold. She could see her destination in the distance, a series of interconnected valleys that stretched toward the Canadian border, their peaks already dusted with snow. Sarah began her hike at 8:30 a.m., following a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The forest was quiet except for the occasional call of a jay or the scurrying of a squirrel through the underbrush.
Where was...
She moved at a steady pace, covering ground efficiently while keeping her eyes open for any signs of human activity or wildlife that might need attention. 3 hours into her hike, she encountered the first sign that this day would be different from all the others. Fresh horse tracks in the soft earth beside the trail, clearly visible in a patch of mud near a small stream. This was unusual. While the park was home to a small population of wild horses, descendants of animals that had escaped from early settlers, they typically stayed in the lower valleys where grass was more abundant. Sarah knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. They were large, much larger than those of the average horse, and the depth of the impressions suggested an animal of considerable size and weight. More interesting was the pattern of the tracks. Unlike domestic horses, which typically move in predictable patterns, these tracks showed the irregular gait of an animal that was moving cautiously, carefully, as if it was investigating something. She followed the tracks for several hundred yards until they disappeared onto rocky ground where they could no longer be seen. Sarah made a note in her log and continued with her patrol, but she found herself thinking about the horse and wondering what had brought it so far from its usual territory. The morning passed uneventfully as Sarah covered the first section of her patrol route. She checked several remote campsites, finding them empty and undisturbed. She investigated a report of possible illegal hunting but found only old shell casings that had probably been there for years. By 11:30 a.m., she was ahead of schedule and feeling good about the progress she was making. It was then that she decided to investigate a series of caves that were marked on her map but that she had never actually visited. The caves were located in a particularly remote section of the park, accessible only by a steep scramble up a rocky slope that most hikers would avoid. But Sarah was curious, and she had enough time before the weather was expected to turn bad. The climb to the caves was more difficult than she had anticipated. The rocky slope was loose and unstable, and several times she had to pause to find secure handholds. As she climbed higher, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of the storm that was approaching from the north. The caves themselves were disappointing. The first two were shallow depressions that barely qualified as caves at all. But the third was more interesting. It extended back into the mountainside for at least 50 feet, and Sarah could feel cold air flowing from somewhere deep inside. She turned on her flashlight and began to explore. The cave was larger than it appeared from the outside, with several chambers connected by narrow passages. In one of the chambers, Sarah found evidence of prehistoric use, ancient fire rings, and what appeared to be primitive tool marks on the walls. She was so absorbed in documenting her find that she lost track of time. When she finally emerged from the cave, the weather had changed dramatically. Dark clouds had moved in from the north, and the wind had increased to the point where it was difficult to maintain her balance on the steep rocky slope. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and Sarah could see snow beginning to fall in the distance. She knew she needed to get down from the exposed rocky area as quickly as possible. Mountain weather could change with deadly speed, and she was still miles from any shelter. She began her descent carefully, testing each step before committing her weight to it. That's when disaster struck. A rock that had seemed solid suddenly shifted under her foot, causing her to lose her balance. She fell backward, sliding down the steep slope on loose gravel and small stones. Desperately, she grabbed for anything that might stop her fall, and her hand closed around what felt like a secure rock outcropping. But instead of stopping her fall, the rock she grabbed broke free from the mountainside, and she found herself falling through space. She had time for one terrified scream before she hit the bottom of a narrow ravine with a sickening impact that drove all the air from her lungs. When Sarah regained consciousness, she immediately knew she was in serious trouble. She was lying at the bottom of a ravine that was perhaps 30 feet deep and barely 10 feet wide. Worse, her right leg was caught in a tangle of roots and debris, and when she tried to move it, waves of pain shot through her body. As her head cleared, she realized that her situation was even worse than she had first thought. She wasn't just trapped at the bottom of a ravine with an injured leg. She was hanging upside down, suspended by her caught foot, with her head pointing toward the bottom of the ravine and her body twisted at an unnatural angle. The root system that had caught her leg was strong enough to support her weight, but it held her in a position that was not only painful but potentially deadly. Blood was already beginning to pool in her head, and she could feel her heartbeat pounding in her temples. She knew from her first aid training that this position could be fatal within hours if she couldn't find a way to get right side up. Sarah tried to reach up to free her leg, but the angle was wrong, and her injured condition made it impossible to generate enough leverage. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, and she could feel herself growing weaker as blood continued to pool in her head. Her radio had been lost in the fall, scattered somewhere on the rocky slope above. Her emergency beacon was in her backpack, but the pack had been torn away during the fall and lay several feet away, just out of reach. Even if she could reach it, she wasn't sure the signal would penetrate the deep, narrow ravine she was trapped in. As the full reality of her situation sank in, Sarah felt a moment of panic. She was trapped, injured, in a location where no one would think to look for her, with weather conditions that would make any rescue attempt extremely difficult. The snow that had been threatening all morning was now falling steadily, and she could hear the wind howling through the rocks above. But Sarah had not survived 12 years as a park ranger by giving up when things got tough. She forced herself to think clearly about her situation and her options. She needed to find a way to signal for help, or she needed to find a way to free herself. Both seemed impossible from her current position, but she refused to accept that this was how her story would end. As she hung there in the growing darkness of the ravine, fighting to stay conscious as blood pooled in her head, Sarah heard a sound that she initially dismissed as just another effect of her deteriorating condition. It was the sound of something large moving through the forest above. something that was approaching the edge of the ravine. She strained to listen, and the sound came again. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps that seemed to pause at the edge of the ravine directly above her. And then, peering down at her from the rim of the ravine, Sarah saw a sight that under normal circumstances would have taken her breath away. It was a horse, but not just any horse. This was clearly the animal whose tracks she had found earlier that morning. A massive stallion with a coat the color of storm clouds and eyes that seemed to hold an intelligence far beyond what she had ever seen in an animal. The horse stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at her with what could only be described as concern. For several long moments, horse and human stared at each other across the 30 feet that separated them. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She was growing weaker by the minute, and she could feel her consciousness beginning to fade. The horse seemed to understand that she was in distress.
Instead of moving on, as any wild animal would normally do when encountering a human, the stallion began to pace back and forth along the edge of the ravine, occasionally stopping to look down at her and emit what sounded almost like a whinny of concern. As darkness began to fall and the snow continued to accumulate, Sarah realized that this magnificent animal might be the only witness to her fate.
She closed her eyes and tried to conserve what strength she had left, knowing that she would need every ounce of it if she was going to survive until morning. But the horse didn't leave. Even as the weather worsened and the temperature continued to drop, the stallion remained at the edge of the ravine, standing guard over the trapped ranger. And as Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, she couldn't shake the feeling that this animal was not just a random witness to her plight, but somehow understood that she needed help.
What she didn't know was that her ordeal was just beginning, and that this remarkable horse was about to prove that intelligence, loyalty, and compassion are not uniquely human traits. The next 4 days would test both of them in ways that neither could have imagined, and would ultimately forge a bond that would capture the imagination of people around the world. The first night was the longest of Sarah's life. Suspended upside down in the narrow ravine, she drifted in and out of consciousness as the storm intensified above her. Snow fell steadily through the opening of the ravine, accumulating on her exposed skin and soaking through her ranger uniform. The temperature dropped to well below freezing, and hypothermia became as immediate a threat as the blood pooling in her head.
But she was not alone. Throughout that terrible first night, the massive stallion remained at the edge of the ravine. Sarah could hear him moving above her, the sound of his hooves on rock and the occasional soft whinny that seemed directed toward her location. During her more lucid moments, she found herself talking to the animal, even though she knew he couldn't understand her words. "I don't know why you're staying," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible even to herself. "But I'm glad you're here." The horse seemed to respond to her voice, moving closer to the edge and making soft sounds that Sarah had never heard from a wild animal before. It was almost as if he was trying to communicate with her, to let her know that he understood she was in distress. As the hours passed, Sarah began to realize that the stallion was doing more than just keeping her company. Several times during the night, she heard sounds from above that suggested the horse was actively working to help her. There was the sound of rocks being moved, of heavy breathing, as if the animal was exerting himself physically. Once, she thought she heard the sound of wood breaking, though she couldn't imagine what the horse might be doing. When dawn finally came, Sarah was shocked to discover what her unlikely guardian had accomplished during the night. Looking up through pain-clouded eyes, she could see that the stallion had somehow managed to drag several large branches to the edge of the ravine. The branches formed a rough windbreak that was deflecting the worst of the storm away from the opening where she was trapped. More remarkably, the horse had apparently spent much of the night dropping small stones and pieces of debris into the ravine. At first, Sarah couldn't understand why he would do this, but as she became more alert, she realized that the horse had been trying to build up the floor of the ravine beneath her head. The accumulation of material had raised the level by several inches, slightly reducing the angle at which she was suspended. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a noticeable difference in her circulation. The slight change in angle meant that blood wasn't pooling quite as severely in her head, and she found herself thinking more clearly than she had since the accident. The horse continued his vigil throughout the second day. When the storm temporarily cleared, he would disappear for short periods. But he always returned. Sarah began to realize that he was leaving to find food and water, but was making these trips as brief as possible so that he could return to watch over her. On one of these trips, the stallion returned with something that made Sarah's heart leap with hope. Somehow, he had found her backpack, which had been lost during her fall. The pack was torn and most of its contents scattered, but it still contained her emergency beacon and some of her medical supplies. The horse seemed to understand that the pack was important. He spent considerable time trying to figure out how to get it down to her, eventually managing to push it to a spot on the ravine wall where it caught on a small ledge about 15 feet above Sarah's position. It was still out of reach, but it was much closer than it had been. By the end of the second day, word had spread among the Park Service that Ranger Mitchell was overdue from her patrol. A search and rescue operation was launched, but the severe weather conditions made it extremely difficult. Helicopters couldn't fly in the storm, and ground teams were having trouble reaching the remote areas where Sarah was supposed to have been patrolling. The search teams were focusing their efforts on the main trails and known campsites. None of them thought to look for her in the area where she had actually fallen because it was so far off her planned route. Sarah's decision to investigate the caves had taken her into territory that wasn't on any of the standard patrol maps. Meanwhile, the horse continued his remarkable vigil.
On the third day, Sarah watched in amazement as the stallion began what could only be described as an attempt to create a rescue system. Using his teeth and hooves, he worked to weave together long grasses and small branches, creating what looked like a primitive rope. The process was painstaking and clearly difficult for an animal without hands, but the horse persisted with a determination that was almost human-like in its intensity. Sarah found herself coaching him from below, even though she knew he couldn't understand her specific words.
"That's it," she would whisper. "You've almost got it. Try wrapping it around that rock." Amazingly, the horse did seem to respond to her voice and gestures. When she pointed toward a particular branch or rock formation, he would often investigate that area. When she made encouraging sounds, he would work with increased vigor. When she showed signs of distress, he would stop what he was doing and look down at her, with what could only be described as concern. The makeshift rope that the horse created was crude, but it was nearly 20 feet long when completed. The stallion spent hours trying to figure out how to secure one end and lower the other towards Sarah. He tried tying it around rocks, around tree roots, and around his own body, but each attempt failed for one reason or another. Sarah could see the frustration in the animal's movements as each attempt failed. But rather than giving up, the horse would pause, seeming to think about the problem and then try a different approach. His problem-solving abilities were unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed in an animal. On the third night, the weather cleared enough for Sarah to see stars through the opening of the ravine. The horse had positioned himself directly above her, lying down so that he could look down at her while conserving his own body heat. Throughout the night, Sarah could hear him moving occasionally, and she realized he was continuing to drop small amounts of debris to gradually raise the floor level beneath her. It was during that third night that Sarah began to understand that this was not just a random act of animal kindness.
The horse's behavior was too purposeful, too intelligent, too sustained to be explained by simple instinct. This animal was making a conscious decision to help her, and was using reasoning abilities to figure out how to do it most effectively.
She began to think about everything she knew about horses, particularly wild horses. These animals were known to be intelligent and social, but what she was witnessing went far beyond anything that had been documented in scientific literature. This horse was demonstrating planning, tool use, and problem-solving abilities that researchers claimed were beyond the capabilities of equines. As the fourth day dawned, Sarah could feel her strength ebbing. Despite the horse's efforts to improve her position, the prolonged suspension was taking a serious toll on her body. Her injured leg had become completely numb, and she was having difficulty staying conscious for extended periods. But the horse seemed to sense her growing weakness, and his efforts became even more desperate. Sarah watched through cloudy eyes as the stallion began what appeared to be a completely new strategy. Instead of trying to lower something down to her, he was now working to create a ramp of stones and debris that would allow him to descend into the ravine himself. The plan was ambitious and dangerous. The ravine walls were steep and unstable, and there was a very real risk that the horse could injure himself or become trapped along with Sarah. But the stallion seemed determined to try. Working with single-minded focus, the horse began rolling larger stones toward the ravine wall. When the stones were too heavy for him to move by pushing, he would use his body weight, leaning against them until they shifted position. Gradually, a rough ramp began to take shape along one wall of the ravine. Sarah tried to discourage him, afraid that he would hurt himself in the attempt. But her voice was too weak to carry, and the horse seemed committed to his course of action. She could only watch as this magnificent animal risked his own safety in an attempt to save her life. It was then that Sarah heard a sound that made her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. From somewhere in the distance came the mechanical whine of helicopters. The search and rescue teams were finally close enough to her location to be heard. But the helicopters were still far away, and Sarah knew that without some way to signal them, they would never find her in the deep, narrow ravine where she was trapped. Her emergency beacon was still in the backpack that the horse had retrieved. but it remained 15 feet above her on the rocky ledge, just out of reach. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was too weak to carry beyond the ravine. She watched helplessly as the sound of the helicopters grew closer, then began to fade as the search teams moved past her location, without detecting any sign of her presence. The horse, however, seemed to understand the significance of the helicopter sounds. As soon as he heard them, he stopped working on his ramp and began making noise. He whinnied loudly, repeatedly, and began striking the rocks at the edge of the ravine with his hooves, creating a rhythmic banging sound that echoed through the mountains.
The stallion continued this signaling behavior for nearly an hour, long after the helicopter sounds had faded.
Even when it became clear that the search teams had moved on, the horse kept up his efforts, as if he understood that they might return and that he needed to be ready to signal them again. As the fourth day wore on, Sarah found herself drifting in and out of consciousness more frequently. She was beginning to hallucinate, seeing faces in the rock walls and hearing voices that she knew weren't really there. But through it all, the steady presence of the horse remained constant.
During her more lucid moments, Sarah found herself thinking about her life, about the choices that had led her to this moment. She thought about her family, about the friends and colleagues who were probably searching for her at that very moment.
And she thought about this remarkable animal who had chosen to stay with her when every instinct should have told him to flee. She began to understand that regardless of what happened to her, she had been privileged to witness something extraordinary.
This horse had demonstrated intelligence, compassion, and loyalty that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about animal cognition. His behavior suggested that the line between human and animal intelligence might not be as clear as people like to believe. As the sun began to set on the fourth day, Sarah could hear the horse making a different kind of sound. Instead of the urgent whinnying he had been using to try to signal the helicopters, this was a softer, more musical sound.
It took her a moment to realize that he was singing to her, making the kind of low, melodious sounds that horses use to comfort each other. The sound was incredibly beautiful and deeply moving.
Even in her weakened state, Sarah felt tears running down her face as she listened to this wild stallion's attempt to comfort her in what might be her final hours. She tried to sing back to him, humming a lullaby that her mother had sung to her as a child.
The horse seemed to respond to her humming, adjusting his own sounds to harmonize with hers. For a few minutes, woman and horse created a strange, beautiful duet that echoed through the ravine and across the mountains beyond.
As darkness fell once again, Sarah prepared herself for what might be her last night, but the horse had one more surprise for her. Throughout the night, she could hear him working above her, and when morning came, she discovered that he had somehow managed to lower the backpack from its perch on the ledge. The pack now hung just a few feet above her, suspended by the makeshift rope that the horse had woven from grass and branches. It was still out of reach, but barely. If she could find the strength for one final effort, she might be able to grab it. Sarah knew this could be her last chance.
The emergency beacon in that pack was her only hope of signaling for help, but reaching for it would require her to twist her body in a way that could worsen her injuries, or even cause her to fall deeper into the ravine.
Looking up at the magnificent stallion who had become her guardian, Sarah made her decision. She would try to reach the pack, not just for her own sake, but for his. This remarkable animal had invested too much effort in trying to save her for her to give up now. As she prepared to make her desperate attempt to reach the emergency beacon, Sarah had no way of knowing that rescue was already on its way. The horse's persistent signaling had been heard by more than just the search helicopters. High above them, circling in the thin mountain air, a golden eagle had been watching the strange partnership between horse and human with interest. And eagles, unlike horses, could fly directly to the search teams and lead them back to exactly where they needed to be. Captain Jake Morrison had been leading search and rescue operations in Glacier National Park for 15 years, and he had seen his share of impossible situations.
But as he stood in the command tent on the morning of the 5th day of searching for Ranger Sarah Mitchell, he was beginning to fear that this might be the one that defeated him. The weather had been their biggest enemy. The early season storm had dumped 3 feet of snow on the higher elevations, making ground travel extremely dangerous and air operations nearly impossible. They had managed only a few brief helicopter flights, and each time they had been forced to turn back due to deteriorating conditions.
"We've covered every trail on her planned route 3 times, reported Sergeant Lisa Chen, Morrison's second-in-command. "We've checked every shelter, every known camping area, every cave system that's marked on the maps. She's just not there." Morrison studied the large topographical map spread across the table in the center of the tent. Red X marks indicated areas that had been searched, and the coverage was extensive. But there were still vast areas of wilderness that remained unchecked, areas that were so remote and difficult to access that they hadn't been prioritized in the search. What about this section here? Morrison pointed to an area several miles north of Sarah's planned route.
It's way off her patrol area, but if she got disoriented in the storm. That's possible, Chen agreed. But Jake, that terrain is nearly impossible to search on foot, and we can't get helicopters in there until the weather clears completely.
We're talking about another 2 or 3 days minimum. Morrison knew she was right, but he also knew that Sarah Mitchell was one of the most experienced rangers in the park.
If anyone could survive for an extended period in the wilderness, it was her. They had to keep searching, no matter how unlikely success seemed.
It was then that one of the younger searchers, a park ranger named Kevin Walsh, burst into the command tent with an expression of excitement and confusion on his face. "Captain Morrison, you need to see this," Walsh said breathlessly. "There's a golden eagle outside the camp and it's acting really strange." Morrison frowned. Wildlife encounters were common during search operations, but they rarely interrupted command meetings.
What do you mean, strange? It's not flying away. It keeps circling the camp, calling out, and then it flies a short distance in the same direction before coming back.
It's like it's trying to get our attention. Morrison was about to dismiss the report when he remembered something from his early training.
Native American search and rescue teams sometimes used animal behavior as a guide when looking for missing persons. Animals often noticed things that humans missed, and their behavior could provide valuable clues.
"Show me," Morrison said, following Walsh outside the tent. The golden eagle was magnificent, with a wingspan that Morrison estimated at nearly 8 feet. The bird was perched on a dead tree about 50 yards from the camp, and as soon as it saw the group of humans emerge from the tent, it began to call loudly and repeatedly. Morrison watched as the eagle took flight, circled the camp once, and then flew in a straight line toward the northeast, covering about a quarter mile before turning around and flying back to its perch.
The bird repeated this behavior 3 times while Morrison watched, each time flying in exactly the same direction. "How long has it been doing this?" Morrison asked.
"About an hour," Walsh replied. "I first noticed it right after sunrise. It's been incredibly persistent." Morrison had seen enough unusual things during his years in search and rescue to have learned not to dismiss anything too quickly. Animal behavior had led to successful rescues before, and the eagle's actions were certainly unusual enough to warrant investigation. "Chen, get me a bearing on the direction that bird is flying," Morrison ordered, "and prepare a ground team. We're going to follow that eagle and see where it leads us." Within an hour, a team of 6 searchers was heading northeast from the base camp. Following the line of flight that the golden eagle had indicated, the bird seemed to understand that it had successfully communicated with the humans, because it began flying ahead of them, staying close enough to remain visible but far enough ahead to serve as a guide. The terrain they were crossing was some of the most difficult in the park.
The recent snowfall had made the already treacherous footing even more dangerous, and the team had to use ropes and climbing gear to navigate several steep sections. But the eagle never wavered from its course, always flying in the same direction, always returning to check that the humans were still following. After 3 hours of difficult hiking, the eagle led them to an area that Morrison didn't recognize from any of the park maps. They were in a section of wilderness that was rarely visited, where ancient glacial activity had carved deep ravines and narrow valleys into the mountainside. The eagle's behavior became even more agitated as they approached this area. The bird began calling continuously and flying in tight circles above a specific location. Morrison realized they were close to whatever the eagle wanted them to find. "Spread out," Morrison ordered his team. "Look for any sign of human activity. Clothing, equipment, footprints, anything." It was Ranger Walsh who made the discovery that would change everything. Following a faint animal trail through a stand of pine trees, he came upon a scene that left him speechless. Standing at the edge of a narrow ravine was the largest wild horse Walsh had ever seen. The stallion was clearly exhausted, his coat matted with snow and ice, but he was standing guard at the edge of the ravine, with a determination that was almost human-like in its intensity. "Captain Morrison!" Walsh called out. "You need to see this." When Morrison arrived, he immediately understood the significance of what they had found. The horse's behavior was unmistakable. This animal was guarding something, protecting something that was down in the ravine below. Morrison approached the edge carefully, not wanting to spook the stallion. What he saw when he looked down into the ravine nearly took his breath away. Suspended upside down about 30 feet below them was Ranger Sarah Mitchell. She was barely conscious, her uniform torn and stained, but she was alive. And around her, Morrison could see clear evidence of the horse's efforts to help her. The floor of the ravine had been built up with stones and debris, clearly placed there deliberately to reduce the angle of Sarah's suspension. A crude but effective windbreak had been constructed from branches at the top of the ravine.
Most remarkably, a makeshift rope, woven from grass and small branches, hung down from the rim, with Sarah's backpack suspended just a few feet above her trapped form. "My God," Morrison whispered. "This horse has been taking care of her." The stallion watched warily as the rescue team prepared their equipment, but he didn't retreat. Even when the helicopters arrived and began hovering overhead, the horse remained at his post, as if he wanted to make sure that these humans were really there to help. The actual rescue operation was complicated by Sarah's position and her weakened condition. She had been suspended upside down for nearly 5 days, and the medical team was concerned about the effects of suddenly changing her orientation. They had to work carefully to support her circulation while gradually rotating her body to an upright position. Throughout the delicate operation, the stallion watched every move. When the rescuers lowered a paramedic into the ravine, the horse moved closer to the edge, as if he wanted to supervise the process. When Sarah was finally freed from the tangle of roots and debris that had held her trapped, the horse made a sound that Morrison would later describe as a whinny of relief. Sarah was conscious enough to be aware of what was happening, and as the rescue team prepared to lift her out of the ravine, she looked up at the stallion and spoke her first words in nearly 2 days. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice barely audible, but her meaning crystal clear. The horse seemed to understand. He approached the edge of the ravine as close as he could get and lowered his massive head toward her. For a moment, woman and horse looked at each other across the distance that separated them, and Morrison felt that he was witnessing something profound and sacred. As Sarah was lifted out of the ravine and prepared for medical evacuation, the full extent of the horse's efforts became clear. The rescue team found evidence that the stallion had been working continuously for 5 days to improve Sarah's situation. He had moved literally tons of material to build up the floor of the ravine. He had constructed the windbreak that had probably saved Sarah's life during the storm. And he had somehow managed to create the rope system that had brought her emergency equipment within reach. Dr.
Emily Rodriguez, the emergency physician who accompanied the helicopter crew, was amazed by Sarah's condition. Considering that she's been hanging upside down for 5 days in sub-freezing temperatures, she's in remarkably good shape, Doctor,
Rodriguez told Morrison. Someone or something was taking very good care of her. As the helicopter prepared to take Sarah to the hospital, she insisted on being able to see the stallion one more time. The horse was standing about 50 yards away, watching the rescue operation with what could only be described as satisfaction. "I need to know he's going to be okay," Sarah told Morrison weakly. "He saved my life. He never left me, not once in 5 days." Morrison assured her that the Park Service would monitor the horse and make sure he was healthy and safe. But privately, he suspected that this remarkable stallion was more than capable of taking care of himself. As the helicopter lifted off with Sarah aboard, Morrison watched the golden eagle that had led them to this location. The bird circled once more and then flew directly toward the stallion, landing on a rock formation near where the horse was standing. For several minutes, eagle and horse remained motionless, as if they were communicating in some way that humans couldn't understand. Then the eagle took flight again, soaring high into the clear mountain air before disappearing over the distant peaks. The stallion watched until the eagle was out of sight, then turned and walked slowly into the forest. Morrison and his team watched until the magnificent animal disappeared among the trees, but none of them moved to follow. They understood instinctively that they had been privileged to witness something extraordinary, and that their role was now finished. As Morrison and his team began the long hike back to base camp, they were already trying to process what they had experienced. The rescue itself was remarkable enough, but it was the evidence of the horse's intelligence and compassion that would haunt their thoughts for years to come. "I've never seen anything like it," said Ranger Chen as they made their way down the mountain. "That horse demonstrated planning, problem-solving, tool use, and sustained altruistic behavior. Those are supposed to be uniquely human traits." Morrison nodded, but he was thinking about something beyond the scientific implications of what they had witnessed. He was thinking about the look in the stallion's eyes when Sarah had thanked him, and the obvious satisfaction the animal had displayed when the rescue was completed. "I don't think we've seen the last of this story," Morrison told his team. "Something this remarkable doesn't stay hidden for long. The whole world is going to want to know about the horse that saved a ranger's life." Morrison was right. Within hours of Sarah's rescue, word of the story had spread throughout the Park Service. By the end of the day, reporters were calling from national news outlets, and by the end of the week, the story of Sarah Mitchell and the stallion she would eventually name Thunder would be known around the world. But for now, as the rescue team made its way back through the wilderness, the focus was on the immediate aftermath of an extraordinary rescue operation. Sarah Mitchell was alive and safe, thanks to the efforts of a remarkable horse who had demonstrated that intelligence, compassion, and heroism were not exclusively human traits. The golden eagle that had led the rescuers to their destination was never seen again in that area of the park. Some of the rangers believed it had been just a coincidence, that the bird had been following its normal territorial patterns and the rescue team had simply misinterpreted its behavior. But Morrison knew better. He had seen too much during his years in the mountains to dismiss the possibility that nature had its own ways of communicating, its own systems of cooperation that humans were only beginning to understand. The eagle had known where Sarah was, just as the horse had understood what she needed, and together, they had orchestrated a rescue that would have been impossible without their intervention. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, Morrison took one last look back toward the area where they had found Sarah and her unlikely guardian. Somewhere in those forests, a remarkable stallion was probably settling down for his first peaceful night's sleep in 5 days, his mission finally complete. And somewhere high above, riding the mountain thermals under a canopy of stars, a golden eagle was returning to its own territory, carrying with it the knowledge that it had played a crucial role in saving a human life. The rescue was over, but the story was just beginning. Sarah Mitchell's recovery at Glacier General Hospital became the center of intense media attention within 48 hours of her rescue. What had started as a routine search and rescue operation had evolved into a story that captured the imagination of people around the world. The idea that a wild horse had spent 5 days actively working to save a human life challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and interspecies cooperation. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been part of the helicopter rescue team, was now Sarah's primary physician. During the initial medical evaluation, Dr. Rodriguez was amazed by Sarah's condition considering the ordeal she had endured.
Medically speaking, Sarah should have died, Dr. Kirat.
Rodriguez explained to the gathered Park Service officials and media representatives. Hanging upside down for extended periods can cause fatal changes in blood pressure and circulation. The fact that she survived 5 days in that position, in sub-freezing temperatures, is unprecedented. What made Sarah's survival even more remarkable was the evidence of deliberate care that the medical team discovered. The positioning of debris beneath Sarah's head had been precisely calculated to reduce the angle of her suspension just enough to prevent fatal blood pooling. The windbreak constructed by the horse had maintained a microclimate around the ravine opening that was several degrees warmer than the surrounding area. 7 came towards it. Someone with advanced medical training couldn't have done a better job of maximizing her chances of survival, Dr. Rodriguez continued. This is the book. It's about history. What time changes and above make you haul. The fact that a wild horse accomplished this through pure intuition and problem-solving ability is simply extraordinary. Sarah herself was weak but coherent, and she insisted on telling her story to anyone who would listen. She was particularly adamant that people understand the intelligence and intentionality behind the horse's actions. This wasn't just instinct, Sarah explained to Park Superintendent David Chen during his visit to the hospital. Thunder, that's what I've decided to call him, was making deliberate decisions about how to help me. He was experimenting with different approaches, learning from his failures and adapting his strategies. I watched him problem solve for 5 days straight. The name Thunder seemed perfect for the massive stallion. According to Sarah's description, the horse's coat was the color of storm clouds, and his presence during the rescue had been as powerful and dramatic as a thunderstorm itself. News of the rescue spread rapidly through social media and traditional news outlets. The story had all the elements that capture public imagination: a life-or-death situation, an unlikely hero, and a challenge to conventional wisdom about animal intelligence. Within a week, #Thunder the Horse was trending on multiple platforms, and video crews were arriving at Glacier National Park from around the world. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a leading equine behaviorist from the University of California, was among the first scientists to arrive at the park to study the incident. Dr. Walsh had spent her career studying horse intelligence, but even she was skeptical about the initial reports. The behaviors being described are unprecedented in the scientific literature, Dr. Walsh explained to the assembled media. Horses are intelligent animals, but sustained altruistic behavior toward another species, combined with complex tool use and problem solving, would represent a level of cognitive sophistication that we haven't documented before. Park officials arranged for Dr. Walsh and her research team to visit the rescue site, while the evidence of Thunder's work was still intact.
What they found there exceeded even their most optimistic expectations.
The construction of the windbreak alone demonstrates planning and engineering skills, Dr. Walsh reported after her site visit.
The horse selected branches of specific lengths and arranged them in a configuration that would create maximum protection from prevailing winds. This required understanding of both weather patterns and basic physics.
The rope that Thunder had woven from grasses and small branches was particularly impressive. Dr.
Walsh's team analyzed the construction and found that the horse had used several different weaving techniques to create a cord that was nearly 20 feet long and strong enough to support the weight of Sarah's backpack. This represents tool manufacture and use at a level that we've only seen in primates and a few bird species. Dr.
Walsh explained, the complexity of the weaving patterns suggests that the horse was not just following instinct, but was actively innovating and problem-solving. Perhaps most remarkably, the positioning of the stones and debris that Thunder had used to build up the floor of the ravine showed clear evidence of understanding cause and effect.
The horse had placed larger stones as a foundation and then gradually built up layers of smaller material to create a stable platform that reduced Sarah's suspension angle by exactly the amount needed to improve her circulation without destabilizing her position. This demonstrates not just intelligence but empathy, Dr.
Walsh concluded. The horse had to understand that Sarah was suffering and had to figure out how to reduce that suffering without making her situation worse. That level of understanding requires theory of mind, the ability to understand the mental states of others. While scientists debated the implications of Thunder's behavior, the horse himself had become something of a local celebrity. Park rangers reported multiple sightings of the stallion in the days following the rescue, and he seemed unusually comfortable around human observers. Ranger Kevin Walsh, who had been part of the rescue team, had been assigned to monitor Thunder's well-being and document his behavior. What Walsh discovered was that the rescue had changed the horse in subtle but important ways. Thunder seems to understand that humans are no longer a threat to him, Walsh reported. He allows people to approach much closer than any wild horse normally would. It's as if the experience with Sarah taught him that humans and horses can cooperate. This behavioral change was unprecedented in the scientific literature on wild horses. Typically, negative encounters with humans led to increased wariness and avoidance behaviors.
But Thunder seemed to have drawn the opposite conclusion from his interaction with Sarah. The media attention was beginning to create practical problems for park management.
Visitors were arriving daily hoping to catch a glimpse of Thunder, and some were venturing into dangerous areas of the park without proper equipment or experience. Park Superintendent Chen was forced to implement new restrictions on access to the area where Thunder was commonly seen.
We want people to appreciate this remarkable animal, Chen explained at a press conference. But we also have to ensure everyone's safety.
Thunder is still a wild horse, and the terrain where he lives is extremely challenging. Sarah, meanwhile, was making a remarkable recovery. The physical trauma from her ordeal was healing faster than doctors had expected, but it was the psychological impact that proved most significant. Her experience with Thunder had fundamentally changed her understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. I've worked in wildlife management for 12 years, Sarah told a visiting documentary crew from National Geographic.
I thought I understood animal behavior, but Thunder taught me that there's so much more going on in animal minds than we realize. He didn't just save my life, he opened my eyes to possibilities I never considered.
Sarah's recovery was complicated by the intense media attention. Reporters and film crews were constantly requesting interviews, and offers were pouring in from book publishers and television producers.
But Sarah was insistent that any publicity should focus on Thunder and the broader implications of his behavior rather than on her own story. I was just lucky to be the person who witnessed Thunder's remarkable intelligence, Sarah insisted. The important thing is what this teaches us about animal cognition and the potential for cooperation between species. Dr. Walsh's research team was working to document every aspect of Thunder's behavior during the rescue. They interviewed Sarah extensively, collected physical evidence from the rescue site, and began a comprehensive behavioral study of Thunder himself. What we're seeing challenges some of our most basic assumptions about the cognitive differences between humans and animals. Dr. Walsh explained to a gathering of scientists at the annual Animal Behavior Society conference. Thunder demonstrated planning, innovation, empathy, and sustained altruistic behavior.
These are traits we've long considered uniquely human. The implications extended beyond animal behavior research.
The story was being discussed in philosophy departments, where scholars debated what Thunder's actions meant for our understanding of consciousness and moral agency. Theologians were exploring the spiritual dimensions of interspecies cooperation,
and educators were using the story to teach children about empathy and the interconnectedness of all living things. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah was finally strong enough to return to the park. Her first priority was to visit Thunder and thank him properly for saving her life. Park officials arranged for a small group to accompany her to the area where the stallion was most commonly seen. They found Thunder grazing peacefully in a meadow about 2 miles from the rescue site. As soon as the horse saw Sarah, his behavior changed dramatically. He approached the group directly, something that wild horses simply didn't do with humans they didn't know. When Thunder reached Sarah, he gently nuzzled her shoulder and made soft sounds that she recognized from their time together in the ravine. Sarah spoke to him quietly, thanking him again for his care and protection. To the amazement of everyone present, Thunder seemed to understand and respond to her words.
It was like watching a reunion between old friends, reported park photographer Maria Santos, who documented the encounter. The bond between Sarah and Thunder was obvious and deeply moving. During the visit, Dr.
Walsh observed Thunder's behavior carefully and made a remarkable discovery. The horse was showing clear signs of what behaviorists call checking behavior, repeatedly looking at Sarah and then at the other humans present, as if he was introducing her to the group and vouching for their trustworthiness. This suggests that Thunder has developed a concept of Sarah as an individual, not just as a member of the human species, Dr. Walsh explained. He's treating her as a friend and ally, which indicates a level of social cognition that we haven't documented in wild horses before. The meeting between Sarah and Thunder was captured on video and quickly went viral on social media. The footage showed clear evidence of recognition and affection between women and horse, and it provided powerful visual confirmation of the bond that had been forged during their extraordinary 5 days together. As news of the reunion spread, offers began pouring in from around the world. Film studios wanted to buy the rights to Sarah's story. Publishers were proposing book deals. Theme parks were interested in creating exhibits based on Thunder's rescue behavior. But Sarah was adamant that Thunder remained free and wild. He's not a tourist attraction or a performer, she insisted. He's a wild horse who happened to perform an act of extraordinary kindness. The best way we can honor that is to respect his freedom and protect his habitat. Park officials agreed with Sarah's position. Special protections were put in place to ensure Thunder's well-being and to minimize human interference with his natural behavior. The area where he lived was designated as a special conservation zone, with restricted access and enhanced monitoring. The story of Sarah and Thunder was beginning to have impacts far beyond Glacier National Park. Animal welfare organizations were using it to advocate for better protection of wild horses. Conservation groups were pointing to it as evidence of the cognitive complexity of wildlife and the need for more comprehensive habitat protection. Educational institutions were incorporating the story into their curricula, using it to teach students about animal intelligence, interspecies cooperation, and the ethical treatment of wildlife. Children around the world were writing letters to Thunder and Sarah, expressing their amazement at the horse's heroic behavior. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the scientific understanding of animal cognition. Thunder's behavior was forcing researchers to reconsider their assumptions about the cognitive abilities of horses and other large mammals. This case is causing us to rewrite textbooks, admitted Dr. Patricia Morrison, a cognitive psychologist at Stanford University.
We're going to have to fundamentally reassess what we think we know about animal intelligence and emotional capacity. As Sarah continued her recovery and Thunder returned to his life in the wilderness, both had been forever changed by their extraordinary encounter. Their story had captured the imagination of people around the world and had opened new frontiers in our understanding of the remarkable intelligence and compassion that exists throughout the animal kingdom. The rescue was complete, but the legacy of their partnership was just beginning to unfold. 1 year later, the meadow where Thunder roamed had been transformed into one of the most studied locations in wildlife research. Scientists from around the world had established a permanent research station nearby, dedicated to understanding the cognitive abilities of wild horses and other large mammals. What had begun as the remarkable story of one horse's heroic behavior had evolved into a revolution in animal cognition research. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had relocated her entire research program to Glacier National Park, where she now served as director of the newly established Institute for Equine Intelligence. The institute had received funding from major universities, government agencies, and private foundations, all eager to understand the implications of Thunder's demonstrated cognitive abilities. Thunder didn't just save Sarah's life, Dr. Walsh explained to a gathering of international researchers at the institute's first annual conference. He challenged our entire understanding of what animals are capable of thinking and feeling. We're discovering that intelligence and empathy may be far more widespread in the animal kingdom than we ever imagined. The research station had documented dozens of instances of complex problem-solving behavior among the local horse population. Thunder's example seemed to have influenced other horses in the area.
as if his innovative behaviors were being learned and passed on to other members of the herd. We're seeing what can only be described as a cultural transmission of problem-solving techniques, reported Dr. Maria Santos, who had joined Dr. Walsh's research team after documenting the reunion between Sarah and Thunder. Horses are teaching each other behaviors that Thunder pioneered, including tool use and cooperative problem-solving. This finding had profound implications for understanding animal culture and learning. If horses could learn complex behaviors from each other and pass them on to future generations, it suggested that animal societies might be far more sophisticated than previously believed. Sarah Mitchell had returned to her duties as a park ranger, but her role had evolved significantly. She now served as a liaison between the research community and park management, helping to ensure that the scientific interest in Thunder and the other horses didn't interfere with their natural behaviors. Sarah had also become an advocate for wildlife protection and animal cognition research.
She traveled regularly to universities and conferences, sharing her story and encouraging others to reconsider their assumptions about animal intelligence. My experience with Thunder taught me that we'd been dramatically underestimating the cognitive abilities of the animals we share this planet with, Sarah told a packed auditorium at the National Wildlife Federation's annual conference.
If we're going to be effective stewards of the natural world, we need to understand that we're not the only intelligent, emotional, moral beings on Earth. Thunder himself had become something of an international celebrity, though he remained completely wild and free.
The Park Service had established strict protocols to protect him from excessive human attention while still allowing researchers to observe and study his behavior. Visitors came from around the world hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous horse, and the park's educational programs now included extensive information about animal intelligence and the importance of wildlife conservation.
Thunder's story had become a powerful tool for teaching people about the remarkable capabilities of wild animals. The horse seemed to understand his special status but remained largely indifferent to human attention.
He continued to live freely in his mountain habitat, though he showed a remarkable tolerance for the presence of researchers and park visitors. Thunder appears to have developed a sophisticated understanding of different types of human behavior, observed Dr.
Walsh during one of her regular monitoring sessions. He can distinguish between researchers, tourists, and park personnel, and he adjusts his behavior accordingly.
This suggests a level of social intelligence that we're only beginning to appreciate. The scientific publications emerging from the Thunder research were reshaping multiple academic fields.
Cognitive psychologists were revising their theories about the evolution of intelligence. Animal behaviorists were developing new methods for studying complex cognition in wild animals.
And conservation biologists were arguing for expanded protections based on the demonstrated cognitive abilities of wildlife.
Dr. Patricia Morrison from Stanford had established a collaborative research program with Dr. Walsh's institute, focusing on the comparative cognition of humans and horses. Their preliminary findings suggested that horses might possess cognitive abilities that were in some ways superior to those of humans. This is the biomagic. Horses have evolved sophisticated abilities for spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and social cooperation, Dr. Morrison explained in her landmark paper published in the journal Nature. Thunder's behavior during Sarah's rescue demonstrated all of these abilities working together in ways that suggest a form of intelligence that's different from human intelligence but equally sophisticated. The implications of this research were beginning to influence policy discussions about wildlife protection and animal welfare. Legal scholars were debating whether animals with demonstrated cognitive abilities should be granted enhanced legal protections. Philosophers were exploring what Thunder's behavior meant for our understanding of moral agency and consciousness. Sarah had also written a book about her experience titled Thunder's Gift. What a Wild Horse Taught Me About Intelligence, Compassion, and Survival.
The book became an international bestseller, with proceeds donated to wildlife conservation organizations and animal cognition research. In the book, Sarah reflected on how her encounter with Thunder had changed her understanding of her role as a park ranger and as a human being sharing the planet with other intelligent species.
Before my accident, I thought of myself as protecting wildlife from human interference, Sarah wrote. After my rescue, I realized that protection isn't enough. We need to recognize animals as partners in the stewardship of our shared world. Thunder didn't just save my life. He taught me that cooperation between species is not only possible but essential for our mutual survival. The second anniversary of the rescue was marked by the dedication of the Thunder Memorial Trail, a new hiking path that led visitors through the area where the rescue had taken place.
The trail included educational stations that explained Thunder's behavior and the broader implications of animal intelligence research. Thunder himself was present at the dedication ceremony, though at a respectful distance.
As Sarah spoke to the gathered crowd about the importance of wildlife protection and animal cognition research, the magnificent stallion grazed peacefully in a nearby meadow, occasionally lifting his head to observe the proceedings. 2 years ago, I fell into a ravine and thought my life was over, Sarah told the crowd. Instead, I discovered a new beginning. Thunder showed me that intelligence, compassion, and heroism aren't uniquely human traits. They're part of the natural world, and they're all around us if we just open our eyes to see them. The research program had expanded beyond horses to include studies of other large mammals in the park. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions were all showing evidence of cognitive abilities that exceeded previous scientific estimates. The Thunder Institute had become a model for wildlife research programs around the world. Dr. Walsh's team had documented numerous instances of complex problem-solving, tool use, and cooperative behavior among the animals they studied. Each new discovery reinforced a growing understanding that the natural world was far more cognitively complex than humans had ever imagined. We're essentially discovering that we live on a planet full of intelligent beings. Walsh explained to a documentary crew from the BBC. Thunder was just the first to demonstrate his intelligence in a way that we couldn't ignore. But he's not unique. He's representative of the cognitive abilities that probably exist throughout the animal kingdom. The story of Sarah and Thunder had also inspired a new generation of wildlife researchers and conservationists. Applications to graduate programs in animal behavior and cognitive science had increased dramatically, with many students citing Thunder's rescue as their inspiration for pursuing careers in animal research. Educational programs based on Thunder's story were being implemented in schools around the world, teaching children about animal intelligence, empathy, and conservation. The story had become a powerful tool for encouraging respect for wildlife and environmental stewardship. Thunder's influence extended beyond the scientific community. Artists, writers, and filmmakers had been inspired by his story to create works that explored the relationship between humans and animals. Museums had created exhibits about animal intelligence, using Thunder's rescue as a central case study. The economic impact of Thunder's fame had also been significant for the local community. Tourism to Glacier National Park had increased substantially, with visitors coming specifically to learn about Thunder and animal intelligence. Local businesses had benefited from the increased tourism, while maintaining their commitment to protecting Thunder's habitat and well-being. Park officials had worked carefully to balance the economic benefits of increased tourism with the need to protect Thunder and the other wildlife in the park. Visitor education programs emphasize the importance of observing animals from a respectful distance and not interfering with their natural behaviors. 3 years after the rescue, Sarah was promoted to Chief Wildlife Program Coordinator for the National Park Service, a newly created position that allowed her to oversee wildlife intelligence research and conservation programs across the entire park system. Her first initiative was to establish Thunder Institutes at major national parks across the country. Thunder's legacy isn't just about one remarkable horse, Sarah explained at her promotion ceremony. It's about recognizing that we share our world with countless intelligent, emotional, moral beings who deserve our respect and protection. The Thunder Institutes will help us learn from animals while ensuring their freedom and well-being. Thunder himself continued to live freely in his mountain home, largely unaware of his global fame. He had established a small herd with several mares, and researchers were eagerly documenting whether his problem-solving abilities would be passed on to his offspring. The first foal born to Thunder's herd showed promising signs of advanced intelligence, displaying curiosity and problem-solving behaviors that exceeded normal developmental patterns for young horses. Walsh and her team were carefully studying the foal's development to understand whether Thunder's cognitive abilities might be hereditary. If intelligence can be inherited in horses the way it can in humans, then Thunder might be the founder of a new lineage of exceptionally intelligent equines. Dr. Walsh speculated. This could have tremendous implications for our understanding of the evolution and inheritance of cognitive abilities. As the 5th anniversary of the rescue approached, plans were underway for an international conference on animal intelligence and interspecies cooperation. Researchers from around the world would gather at Glacier National Park to share their findings and discuss the implications of Thunder's legacy for science, conservation, and human-animal relationships. Sarah, now a recognized expert on wildlife intelligence and conservation, was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. Her topic would be Learning from Thunder, How One Horse Changed Our Understanding of Intelligence, Compassion, and Cooperation in the Natural World. The conference would take place in the meadow where Thunder lived, with the magnificent stallion as a living symbol of the intelligence and compassion that existed throughout the animal kingdom. It would be a celebration not just of one remarkable horse, but of the countless intelligent beings that shared the planet with humanity. Thunder's story had begun with a desperate rescue in a remote mountain ravine. but it had evolved into something much larger, a new understanding of the cognitive richness of the natural world, and a recognition that humans were not alone in possessing intelligence, emotion, and moral agency.
As Sarah often said in her speeches around the world, thunder didn't just save my life, he saved our understanding of what it means to be intelligent, compassionate, and truly alive.
And in doing so, he may have saved our relationship with the natural world itself. The legacy of Thunder the Horse would continue for generations, inspiring new research, new conservation efforts, and new respect for the remarkable intelligence that existed throughout the animal kingdom.
His story had proven that heroes come in all forms, and that intelligence, compassion, and courage are not exclusively human traits but part of the broader tapestry of life on Earth. In the mountain meadow where it all began, Thunder continued to graze peacefully under the vast Montana sky, a living reminder that the natural world was far more complex, intelligent, and remarkable than humanity had ever dared to imagine.